All right, so story time, you guys. The not about me, but just about comics. Like, cause see, like back in the day, are you guys familiar with the Comics Code Authority? Let me show you the Comics Code Authority. All right, let me grab you a comic. I will. Let me be right back. All right. All right. Here we go. Right. See, this is a here. Let me do this. This is a Superman comic, right? And back in the day, like every issue had to be approved by the Comics Code Authority. And you could tell if a comic was approved by the Comics Code Authority because it had this little stamp on it. See, it's like right over here. It says approved. It's too blurry to see, but it says approved by the Comics Code Authority, and it had that nice little symbol on it. Now, see what that is way back in the like 50s or whatever, there was like a moral panic about comic books. Like parents were freaking out that like kids were going to be like corrupted by comic books, because comic books, I mean, like even just like, Batman comics, and mind you, Batman back then was not like Batman today. Batman then was like super innocent. It was directed at kids, and it was just like, it was legit just, the Riddler like is planting riddles all over the city, and Batman's like, Robin, how shall we stop this crime? It was super cheesy, super innocent. But, like psychologist Friedrich Wertham wrote this book called Seduction of the Innocent, right? And in that book, he argues that that comics are corrupting, America's kids, that it's turning them, into criminals, that it's turning some of them gay, that it's like, back then before the world changed. So because there was this moral panic all of a sudden, it was getting really bad. Like Congress was on the verge of passing laws to strictly regulate the kinds of comics that could be made. And the comics industry didn't want that to happen. So to avoid Congress having to pass that law, the comics industry was just like, okay, we surrender. We will make an organization that like a rating system that we all have to follow. That's called the Comics Code Authority. Every comic, like all the different comics companies like DC and Marvel and those guys, they agreed to put, this stuff approved by the Comics Code Authority on every issue. And that means for it to get that stamp, it had to meet certain standards. So that means it can't have like certain kinds of violence. It can't have certain definitely no swearing. And there's like certain specific things that are like weirdly specific. Like some of them seemed like they were targeted at particular comic books, but whatever. However, you got to see the long arc of history, because the Comics Code Authority did not last forever. It lasted for decades. In fact, when I was a kid, every comic I bought had approved by had the little stamp approved by the Comics Code Authority on it. But today, if I go get you a Superman comic from today, hold on. Here, this comic is from was this 2019, I think? April 2020. Okay, this comic is from April 2020. And this is Superman comic, Superman Heroes, all right? Where's the stamp? You don't see it, do you? There's no stamp. Because DC no longer follows the Comics Code Authority. You see, back in the 80s, because they made the Comics Code Authority in the 50s, but then a few decades later in the 80s, it's the comics company started to realize, I don't think anyone cares about the Comics Code Authority anymore. Culture is changing. I think we're kind of past that. And so DC actually created an imprint called Vertigo to kind of test the waters, right? They started selling comics that, like, under their Vertigo heading, they could sell comics that, like, here, let me show you what I'm talking about. A Vertigo comics. It's sort of like dark and mature themed comics. Yeah, look, this is the Sandman. This is like one of the early Vertigo comics. What happened was they made Vertigo to kind of test if they could, like, make comics outside without getting the approval of the Comics Code Authority. Like, could they do that without causing a moral panic again? And they made it and no one cared. And then so they're like, all right. So then after a while, there was no need for Vertigo anymore because now the main DC comics no longer follow the Comics Code Authority. So they just, like, all the stuff that used to go in Vertigo can just be a DC comic now. So yeah, that's the story.